Hey everybody, this is Matt here with another chess analysis from a game played on Chess Live. In this game, I was playing on the white pieces, and I was currently ranked 1506, and my opponent was ebbenil, ranked 1487. This was a 10-minute game, so not quite blitz, but not exactly a lot of time either. And it goes into a queen's gambit declined, and the reason I wanted to get into this, it goes over it. A tactic kind of shows up. The tactic didn't get to get used, but it is something I wanted to talk about, and it's the windmill, and I'll go over that more later. But the play began out with pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, and knight to f6. And from here, knight to f3, knight to c3, and pawn to e6. And I opted to go into a sort of Catalan. Technically, it's a Queen's Gambit decline line because I exchange. Typically, the Catalan, you'll see the pawn come up, and then this pawn is taken. So white kind of gambits off a pawn in order to get some development. And I make a mistake, and I try capturing the pawn on D. I'm sorry, I'm one move ahead of myself. First, the knights develop, and then we see the pawn capture and the pawn recapture, and then I try to go into a kind of a late Catalan system. But the problem with this is that this puts me behind in development, and it allows black to have a pretty active position that black takes advantage of pretty quickly, and I end up regretting doing it. So it is better to just gambit off that pawn and to fight for the pawn later rather than just try trading it off. And we'll see why in a moment. But from here we see bishop to b4 and bishop to d2 trying to break the pin. And now we see the bishop come to f5, and you can just see all the black pieces are kind of just coming into the board and really putting a lot of pressure onto the white position. Excuse me. And from here we see a3 trying to relieve some of the tension here in the queen side. And now we have an exchange of pieces, and the pawn comes to h5, h6, preventing this knight from being able to jump up here to g5. And now we see bishop to g2 and castles, and we see castles from white. And at the moment the position is not too bad for white. Black does have a slight edge in this position though. From here we see rook to e8, and I follow suit with rook to e1, just putting our rooks on what is going to appear to be a good file for them. This is already half open for the black, and it could easily become open once this pawn maybe advances to e4 later in the game, if I can get enough support on it to open up these files for the rooks. From here we see knight to e4. It's putting pressure on the bishop, and I kind of make a mistake, and I end up trying to hold on to this bishop, and this bishop does absolutely nothing for me the entire game. I don't hold on immediately. There's really no way to hold on to the bishop, and so I just put rook on c1 so that if the knight were to capture, which is not in black's favor because this is a very good spot for the knight to just sit on. There's really no way to get rid of the knight anytime soon. Since this pawn cannot come up, and this bishop is a very important piece of this setup, since I had made this pawn come up to g3. So there's really no real easy way to kick this knight off the square at the moment, and so I just play. We see the queen play to d7, and then I play pawn to b4, wanting to sneak my bishop out of the line of fire, but it ends up being a really bad move to do that, and we'll see why in just a moment. And so we see from black a6, just preventing this pawn from just advancing up and kicking this knight around. And now I play bishop to b2, which is I really regret playing. My pawns are really not supporting that bishop at all. 6 of my 7 pawns are going to be on dark squares, And in fact, this pawn is going to end up coming up, and this bishop is just completely useless. It will be on this square for the remainder of the game, doing absolutely nothing except defending this pawn. So from here we see bishop to h3, and I make a second mistake, and luckily my opponent did not capitalize on the mistake, although they did try. I tried to scoot my bishop back to h1. The best move was to just keep it there and let black exchange the bishops off, even though that hurts my kingside. Bringing the bishop back hurts my kingside even more after the move queen to f5, because now the knight is pinned to this square, or else there's mate in one if the knight were to move. And so now I'm finding myself in a very tight situation to be in, and trying to figure out ways to get out of it. The correct move was to actually move my bishop back to g2 to get this bishop to trade off for it. But I didn't do that. I didn't think that was the right move since I had just moved it back. I didn't think moving it back up to undo my misplay and losing tempo would be the best move. And so I make the move e3, trying to get more defense on this knight with the queen, and to allow spots for either a rook to come up or the queen to come up to defend this square. So this, let me do another color, so that this knight can move somewhere, maybe potentially here, to attack the queen later in the game. But I have to get more defense on this square before I can do that. And now we see the bishop come back to g4, putting more pressure on the knight. And so now I can scoot my rook over to f2, defending this pawn. If he brought the bishop back, then I was just going to bring this bishop back up to block that sort of attack. And so I've really lost a lot of tempo, and my position's very weak. My bishop is very bad. It's doing nothing. All my pawns are on dark squares. This queen's really not doing anything besides watching this knight, and the bishop's not doing anything besides watching this knight as well. And this rook is being tied down to watching a pawn. So this is a very bad position to be in. But luckily my opponent makes not the most accurate moves, and I'm able to get out of the position. But it's just really not, it's very difficult to really find something productive to do at this point. And so from here we see the pawn come up to h5. This was really more of a mistake, because now I can just play, as I was wanting to do, knight to h4. And this is another thing to keep in mind. When you're in a very tough position, like your opponent's just really attacking you, the best way to get out of that is to try to offer exchanges. In this case, I'm offering a queen exchange. I want the queens off the board, so that this queen's no longer putting all this pressure on this pawn, making my rook watch the pawn. And I'm just trying to open up some exchanges to get through. And the best play for black was to just capture the queen. But black makes a mistake trying to avoid the exchange, because you typically don't want to exchange off pieces when you're in a strong position, because that's just making you lose your advantage. But in this specific case, it was better to trade off the material. But instead we see the queen back up, trying to maintain pressure but not get traded. And now that pawn can just be pushed forward, and it's threatening to win material in some way. And the way that black dealt with that was by moving the bishop, trying to threaten the rook. But it's not a real threat, because I can still win the knight and the bishop. So I actually gain material. Rather than capturing the bishop immediately, I move this pawn up first. And it's simply to avoid getting this pawn captured and equalizing the material that I had just gotten. So this is just a in-between move to get that queen to move to another square. In this case, it was moved over to g5, attacking this free pawn. And I just go ahead and regain the material with the king. And we don't see the queen capture this pawn yet, because my bishop's also pressuring a pawn. But from here, black makes another inaccurate move, and it's f6, trying to break up this pawn. The idea was to break up this pawn so that this rook would have sight of this, and the rook could get some more play. But after the bishop captures on d5 and the king moves to the corner, after about 3 or 4 minutes, I found a really strong move, and it goes into that tactic called the windmill. And the move is queen to d3. And the queen to d3 does two things. The first thing, the immediate thing that it does, is that it defends this pawn that the queen was attacking, which is one of the main things I was looking for. How can I defend that pawn? What are my options? Well, my options were really the queen. I could maybe advance the pawn. That was another option, but there's really, I mean, the king could defend it, but nothing else could. So the queen was kind of in a forced position to move in order to keep this material. But another thing this does is that it sets up a windmill, and the windmill is this. Let me get that color off. Okay, this bishop is attacking this diagonal, and the queen is attacking this diagonal, and the knight is threatening to come here with check to the king, making the king move, and then the knight can then move to another square, let's just say for example here, and so the knight is being able to get some movements around because of the discovered check that I would have gotten on the queen. That's the reason I moved this here. What I did not realize is that this wasn't really a windmill, it was a checkmate, or I was going to gain a queen if black didn't play very carefully. And black did not see the tactic that I just set up, and instead try to kick this bishop off the square by moving the rook over to d8. But now when the knight comes to g6 check on the king, there's only two options. The king can either move here, or the queen can capture the knight. And it turns out that moving the king leads to checkmate, which is the continuation we saw in the game. But black thought that they could get out of the situation by not losing the queen, but that was the only way out. And from here we see the king come up, and I was still kind of in my windmill idea. I was trying to find, where can I move my knight to get, gain a good, where's the best square for my knight to jump in order to gain a good attack. And there was nowhere that my knight could jump to gain good material. I could potentially gain a pawn by trading the knights and then the bishop hitting the rook. That was one potential thing that I was looking at. And no other square. I can't move my knight. You ideally want to move in a windmill a piece in order to take a piece that's more valuable. Like if I could move, let's just say this rook was on this square right here, and there wasn't a mate threat, then I can move the knight here, check, and then take the rook. And so that would be one very good usage of the windmill, letting you gain an exchange or a piece. But in this continuation, I ended up seeing a checkmate, and it was actually kind of obvious, but I was really focused on trying to get a windmill tactic, and I realized that there was actually a forced mate in two, and it's knight to f8, and this is another powerful tactic that we saw in this game. It's a double check on the king. There's the queen and the knight are attacking the king, and anytime there's a double check, you can't just defend. You can't just capture the knight, and you can't just block the view. You have to move your king. There's no choice. And in this case, it doesn't matter if the king moves here or here. It's checkmate no matter what. And so we see the king move up, and now we see checkmate from the queen. And that was the end of the match. I mainly want to make this video just to have to demonstrate some of the strong tactics that you don't always see, like double checks or the windmill. Although my windmill tactic ended up just leading to mate and not an actual windmill. But it's more like seeing that you can set up these tactics in your own game and try to use them to your advantage. In this case, the setup, if played completely right, I would have won a queen for a bishop and a knight, which would have been a winning trade for me. But my opponent didn't see that, and so I got a mate instead. But it's really a matter of recognizing that there are these really good tactics, and that to see them in your own games. This is actually the first time that I've actually been able to incorporate a windmill strategy in one of my own games. I have difficulty finding them, but being aware of the tactic itself really does help in finding the tactic in your own matches. And so I hope you found this video helpful, and thanks for watching.